Title: Whispers in the Shadows. Chapter 1: The Walk Home. It was a walk that Luke had done 100 times before, and yet tonight it felt different. It wasn't the familiar path that had shifted. It was something else, something in the air. The sun had just begun to set, casting long shadows over the forest as Luke left Max's house. The sky above was bruised, shades of purple and pink bleeding into each other. But the light was fading too quickly, and soon the woods would swallow him whole. The path through the woods was no stranger to him. It had always been just a quiet, simple 15-minute walk, cutting through the forest that separated Max's house from his own. The trees whispered in the wind, their branches creaking in the evening air, but Luke had long since become accustomed to it. Yet tonight there was a tension that he couldn't shake, something that clung to the air, heavy and thick, like a storm waiting to break. His footsteps were softer than usual, muffled by the deepening darkness, but there was something else too, a feeling, like the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. A pressure in the air, as if something unseen was hovering just out of sight, watching, waiting. Luke had always been a rational kid. He never believed in ghosts or monsters. He thought that all the stories, the scary movies and the tales his friends told were just that, stories. But tonight, something felt wrong. Something in the woods, something in the silence between the usual evening sounds, gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. It was like an itch at the back of his mind, too faint to scratch, but too persistent to ignore. He kicked at a stone on the path, watching it tumble into the underbrush, the sound echoing in the stillness. He should have been used to it by now. The isolation of the walk, the murmur of the wind in the trees. But tonight, every crack of a branch, every rustling leaf, seemed amplified. Every step he took felt heavier, and the shadows around him grew darker, as if they were shifting, stretching toward him. It was almost as if the woods were alive. He shook his head, trying to dispel the thought. He was being ridiculous. The night air was cold, but not unbearable. He had taken this walk countless times before, in every season, in every kind of weather, and never once had anything strange happened. Yet now, his every instinct screamed at him to turn around and go back, to call Max's parents to come pick him up. But that would be weak, he told himself. That would be stupid. He'd gotten this far, and if there was one thing Luke could pride himself on, it was that he never ran from fear. He might feel it, but he never let it control him. The path narrowed as he walked deeper into the forest. The towering trees on either side seemed to lean in closer, their branches twisting together, blocking out what little moonlight had been left behind. The path wound around the base of the hill and dipped into a small ravine, where the creek cut through the woods, the sound of rushing water mixing with the wind. He had only a few minutes left. The house was just beyond this last stretch of trees, and he could almost see the welcoming lights of home, flickering faintly in the distance. But then, something changed. At first it was subtle, a shift in the air, a change in the rhythm of the wind. The trees had gone silent, their leaves no longer stirring with the breeze. Luke stopped in his tracks, glancing around, his heart starting to race in his chest. It was too quiet, too still. The branches above him hung heavy, like dark, gnarled hands reaching out to grab him, and the shadows beneath his feet seemed darker now, as if the darkness itself had weight. His breath was shallow, his eyes darting around the clearing. But there was nothing. Just the trees and the brush, bathed in the dim light of the fading day. He took another step, forcing himself to keep moving, but the feeling only grew stronger. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones. He didn't know what it was, but his body was telling him to turn around, to run, to escape the suffocating air around him. And then, just as his foot hit the ground, a branch snapped. Luke froze, every muscle in his body locking up. He turned quickly, heart pounding, and scanned the darkening woods. He saw nothing. No movement, no animal scurrying through the underbrush, no sign of life. Yet the sound, the crack of the branch, had been too distinct, too deliberate to have been the wind. His pulse quickened, and his legs tensed, ready to run if need be. But again, there was nothing. The forest was silent. The oppressive stillness seemed to press down on him, and for the first time, he realized just how isolated he was. His house was miles away, his phone tucked deep in his pocket. Not even a light on in the distant distance to offer any sign of safety. He was alone in this vast, hollow dark. He could hear his own breath, ragged and sharp in his ears. And the more he listened, the more he could feel it. The presence. He shook his head, trying to dispel the thought. There was nothing here. There was no reason to be afraid. But even as the thought crossed his mind, the familiar sound of wind rustling through the leaves seemed to return. Only now it had a different quality. A soft, rhythmic dragging sound beneath it. It was like someone, was following him, mimicking his steps, pacing him through the woods. He quickened his pace, telling himself it was just his imagination, but it felt real now. It wasn't just in his head. He could feel it in the weight of the air, in the hairs on the back of his neck prickling, in the suffocating silence that had replaced the sounds of nature. The path ahead seemed longer, the trees crowding closer, as if the forest was shrinking, trapping him. He glanced behind him again. There, in the shadows, was something. He wasn't sure what it was, but he saw it. Just a glimpse, just a flicker of motion. A shadow, a form, something dark and wrong. Luke's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to scream, to run, but his feet were frozen, his heart hammering in his chest. The air around him felt cold now, unnaturally cold, like the temperature had dropped suddenly, sharply, as if the night itself was closing in around him. He blinked, and it was gone. The shadow, whatever it was, had disappeared into the dark, leaving only the sound of his quickened breaths and the faint, eerie whispers of the wind. But Luke knew what he had seen. It hadn't been his imagination. There was something in the woods, something that was following him. His pulse raced, and his feet moved before he could stop them, quickening into a jog, then a run. He didn't look back this time. He couldn't. He could feel it. It was there, right behind him, just out of sight, but close enough that he could feel its eyes on him. He pushed himself faster, harder, through the trees, past the creek, his breath sharp and ragged in the cold night air. His mind raced. What was it? Who was it? What did it want? And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it again. The figure, a shape, shifting in the shadows, dark against the backdrop of the trees, moving with him, keeping pace. It was tall, too tall, and it had no clear features, only dark, twisted limbs that stretched unnaturally long. It was moving toward him, but it wasn't running. It was gliding, like it was floating just above the ground, not bound by the laws of nature, not bound by the limitations of the world Luke knew. He could feel it closing in, hear its breath now, soft and wet, like it was breathing through the trees, the space between them. And then, the whisper came. Run! The voice was deep, guttural, and it wasn't in his head this time. It was real, alive, coming from the shadows. A warning, a command. His heart stopped, and Luke ran. Chapter 1. The walk home sets the stage for the protagonist's growing terror, with Luke's walk home becoming a race against an unseen supernatural force that is slowly tightening its grip on him. The increasing tension, the subtle terror of being followed, and the presence that lurks in the shadows all build up the atmosphere of fear and dread, signaling that the terror he faces is just beginning. The woods, the whispers, and the creeping figures are mere glimpses into the horror that will unfold, drawing Luke deeper into a nightmare that blurs the line between his mind and reality. Chapter 2. The Pursuit. Luke's breath came in ragged gasps as his feet pounded against the uneven forest path. The sound of his footsteps strangely loud against the suffocating silence that surrounded him. The woods, once a familiar sanctuary where he could let his thoughts roam free, now felt like a labyrinth, its trees closing in on him, trapping him within their gnarled embrace. The further he ran, the more distorted the path seemed, as if the very ground was shifting beneath his feet, making it impossible to tell where the way forward lay. The trees twisted and curled, their branches reaching like long, spindly fingers, and the shadows between them seemed to move, following his every step. He didn't dare look back, but every part of him screamed that something was there, something behind him, just out of reach, something stalking him with relentless patience. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the growing dread that gripped his heart. It's just my imagination, he tried to convince himself. I'm just seeing things, hearing things. It's nothing. But deep down, in the deepest recesses of his thoughts, he knew it wasn't nothing. It was something real, something dangerous. Every time he turned a corner or veered slightly off the path, it seemed as if the forest itself responded. Branches snapping underfoot, leaves rustling, a shift in the air, but there was no wind. There was no sound except for his own breathing, his heart pounding in his chest. The silence was the strangest part. How could something so terrifyingly close be so silent? There was no crunch of leaves, no twigs breaking, no sound of footsteps mirroring his. And yet, there was something there. The whisper from earlier still echoed in his mind. It had been soft at first, as if it had come from far away. But now, it was close, so close that he could almost feel it, like a breath on the back of his neck. Run! The voice had been simple, but the command was clear. It wasn't a warning, it wasn't a suggestion, it was an order, and it was meant for him. He had heard it before, in the house when he was younger, in his nightmares, but never in the woods. Never this real. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he sprinted through the trees, his legs burning with exhaustion. The path should have been getting clearer. The end should have been close. But with every step, it felt as if the darkness was swallowing him whole, pulling him deeper into its suffocating grip. The branches overhead shifted, creaking as if they were alive, bending down toward him, closing off the faint light from the fading sky. The shadows lengthened, moving with a life of their own, as though they were following him, dragging along the forest floor, creeping toward his feet. He stumbled, his foot catching on a hidden root, and he fell forward into the dirt. The world spun for a moment as he lay there, his breath ragged in the cold air, his heart hammering in his chest. He forced himself to get up, pushing against the ground with trembling hands. He couldn't afford to stop, not now, not when he could feel the presence so close. He had to keep running, but as he stood, something caught his eye. A figure. For a split second it appeared, just beyond the trees, in the corner of his vision. A dark shape, towering, yet hunched over in a way that wasn't quite human. It was a shadow, its form too indistinct, too fleeting to make sense of. But he had seen it. He had seen something. His pulse spiked, and he took off running again, faster this time, not caring about the branches scratching at his arms or the uneven ground beneath him. His body was moving on pure instinct now. The sound of his feet thudding against the dirt was deafening in the silence that surrounded him. His breath burned in his chest, each inhale feeling like it would be his last. The world around him seemed to blur, the trees spinning, the shadows warping, until everything felt like it was closing in on him. And then he heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, soft at first, almost imperceptible, like the padding of bare feet against soft earth. But as it grew closer, the sound became louder, clearer, and Luke knew. He wasn't alone. Whatever was chasing him had closed the distance. It was behind him, following him. Luke's mind screamed for him to look back, to confirm what he already knew, but he couldn't. He had learned that much from his nightmares. To look back was to invite the darkness to catch him, to give it power. He had to keep moving, keep running, no matter what. The trees ahead of him parted slightly, offering a glimpse of a small clearing, the edge of the forest where he knew the path home would be. He could see the faint flicker of lights in the distance, the warm glow of street lamps, the welcome security of his neighborhood just beyond the woods. He was almost there, but the footsteps were closer now, impossibly close, right behind him, echoing his every move. It's close. Luke's pulse quickened again, and his legs screamed in protest as he pushed himself forward, faster, harder, willing his body to keep going despite the exhaustion, despite the fear that threatened to paralyze him. The lights were almost there. He could almost reach them, and the thought of safety was enough to drive him forward, to make him push through the pain. But as he reached the clearing, he stumbled. His foot caught on something in the underbrush, and he pitched forward, crashing to the ground, the world spinning around him as he hit the earth with a sickening thud. Pain exploded in his body, his arms, his legs, his head, all of them screaming in agony as he struggled to push himself back up. His palms scraped against the dirt as he rose to his knees, gasping for air, and then he saw it again. The figure. It was right there, standing at the edge of the clearing, just within the shadow of the trees. It was tall, taller than any person he had ever seen, and its form was twisted, bent at impossible angles. Its limbs were long, far too long, stretching out from its body like spider legs, and its face was a blur, obscured by shadows, but Luke could feel its eyes. Dark, empty, hungry. The creature's presence consumed the space, filling every inch of the clearing with a cold, suffocating air. Its breath was ragged, wet, and Luke could feel the pulse of its hunger in the air around him. His blood ran cold, and every instinct in his body screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. His body was frozen in place, paralyzed with fear. The creature took a step forward, its feet moving silently over the ground, gliding like it wasn't even touching the earth. It was closer now, so close that Luke could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. He could see its hands, too many fingers, stretched and curled like claws, reaching toward him. And then, it spoke. The voice wasn't human. It wasn't even a voice at all. It was a sound, low, guttural, vibrating deep in the earth, filling the air with a deep, rumbling resonance that seemed to come from all around him. It was a voice that spoke directly into his mind, into his soul. "You shouldn't have run." The words echoed inside his skull, and Luke's body trembled violently, but he couldn't make himself move. The figure was too close, too real, and it was here to claim him. He had known it the moment he had started running, the moment he had heard those footsteps following him, those whispers growing louder. It was too late. He had fed it with his fear, with his attempts to escape, and now it was time to face the consequences. The thing stepped closer, its face coming into view, the darkness still covering it, yet Luke could feel the coldness emanating from it. He could feel it pressing in from all sides. It was part of the woods, it was part of the darkness, and it was part of him now. "You belong to the forest." And as it reached for him, Luke could no longer tell where the forest ended and where he began. Tata Freiband, Chapter 2. The pursuit expands on Luke's growing terror as he is stalked through the woods by a malevolent presence. The line between fear and reality becomes increasingly blurred as the creature that follows him becomes more tangible, pushing Luke to the brink of his sanity. The fear is not just external, it's internal, as the woods themselves seem to reflect his own terror, distorting the environment around him, trapping him in a psychological and physical nightmare. The chapter ends on a haunting note, as the true nature of the creature begins to emerge and the protagonist realizes that he can't outrun what is following him. Chapter 4. The house awakens. The weight of the forest closed in on Luke, thick and suffocating, as if the trees themselves had grown alive, pressing inward on him. The whispers had returned, not as a murmur in the distance, but as a chorus in his mind, flooding his thoughts until they were nothing but a sea of noise. "Run," they said. "Keep moving." But where could he run? The woods stretched endlessly ahead of him, and behind him, there was only the growing darkness, the very shadows themselves seemingly chasing after him, devouring the light. Every step felt like he was sinking deeper into some kind of waking nightmare. The ground beneath his feet had become treacherous, as though it were shifting, changing, forcing him to move faster, but the path was lost, swallowed by the ever-thickening fog that clung to the trees. The wind had died down, but the air was unnaturally cold, like the breath of something ancient, something that had been hidden for centuries, waiting for the moment to emerge. The trees, once familiar, now seemed alien, twisted, malformed, their branches reaching for him with gnarled fingers that clawed at the air, scratching at his skin. He had never seen the woods this way before. The shapes of the trees warped and pulsed with an unnatural energy, casting long shadows that seemed to writhe and shift in the corners of his vision. His heartbeat raced in his chest, a rapid, frantic rhythm that echoed in his skull. And still, the whispers, those voices, gathered in the dark corners of his mind, urging him forward, pulling him deeper into the madness. "Run! Run!" The command was not just in his head anymore. It was in the very air around him, a deep, guttural voice that seemed to vibrate through his bones. The moment the voice spoke, his feet moved faster, despite the exhaustion seeping through every muscle in his body. There was no room for hesitation anymore. There was no time for doubt. He had to keep running. He had to outrun the darkness. But even as he forced himself forward, something shifted. At first, it was subtle, just a flicker of motion at the edge of his vision. Then, a sound, like the soft crackle of dry leaves underfoot, but too distinct to be the wind. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. The noise came again, this time closer, like footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing his every movement. Luke's heart skipped a beat, and he spun around to face the dark woods behind him. The path he had been following seemed different now. The trees were more crowded, more oppressive, their trunks bent inward, forming a tunnel, a tight corridor of darkness that stretched endlessly ahead. And there, just beyond the reach of the dim light from the last fading streak of sunlight, he saw it. A figure. It was tall, impossibly so, its silhouette dark against the deepening shadows of the woods. The shape was elongated, stretched like a shadow too large to be contained, its limbs too long, too thin. It didn't move like a human. It glided, its feet barely touching the ground, its movements smooth and fluid as if it were made from the darkness itself. Luke could see only the vaguest outline of its form, but there was something wrong about it. Its presence in the forest was a violation, an unnatural blot in a place that had always been calm, a place that had once been his sanctuary. The figure took another step toward him, and the ground beneath Luke's feet seemed to tremble. The trees swayed, their branches groaning as if in protest, and the air grew even colder, a biting chill that seeped into his bones, gnawing at him from the inside out. The whispers grew louder. "Run!" Luke took a step back, but the figure continued to move, closer, closer, until its outline was clear enough for him to see the faintest hint of its face. It wasn't like a human's face. It wasn't even a face at all. It was nothing. It was a blank, empty void, a hollow space where a face should have been, its features obscured by the thick shadows that seemed to swirl around it, as though the darkness itself were alive. And then, it spoke. The voice was not what Luke had expected. It wasn't deep or growling. It wasn't the voice of a monster or a beast. No, it was a whisper, soft and distant, as if it were coming from far away. Yet somehow it felt so close, so intimate, that it seemed to reverberate in his very bones. "You're not supposed to be here." Luke stumbled back, his body trembling as the words rang in his ears. The forest was silent now, except for the faint, eerie rustle of the leaves in the wind, and the sound of his own frantic breath. The figure was so close now that he could feel its presence pressing against him, like an invisible weight, suffocating him. He wanted to run, but his legs refused to obey. His body was frozen, gripped by fear, by an instinct that told him that if he ran now, he would be lost, trapped forever in the darkness. The figure reached out a hand, or something that looked like a hand. Too long, too thin, its fingers twisted like blackened roots, reaching for him with slow, deliberate movements. The moment its fingers brushed his skin, everything around him seemed to change. The forest seemed to melt away. The trees, the dirt, the fog, everything disappeared in an instant. It was as if the very ground beneath him had fallen away, swallowed by the darkness. Luke was no longer standing in the woods. He was somewhere else, somewhere far colder, far darker. He was in the house. The realization hit him with the force of a sledgehammer. The walls were closing in, not just around him but inside his mind, the shadows stretching impossibly far, twisting into shapes that defied all logic. The very air in the room felt wrong, thick and stifling, as though it was pressing against his chest, crushing him with its weight. He could smell it now, an old, musty scent that clung to everything, like the rot of forgotten years, like the decay of something that had been buried long ago. The house had never truly been a place. It had always been a presence, a thing that followed him, that watched him, a thing that lived, breathing and moving with him, feeding on his fear, growing stronger with every step he took. "You've always been here," The voice echoed through his mind, repeating the same words over and over, as if trying to break him, to fill him with the terrible truth. The truth that he had known all along but had refused to accept. The house wasn't just a structure. It wasn't just an old, abandoned building that he had wandered into one night. It was a part of him. It had always been a part of him. And now, it was waking, it was alive, and it was hungry. Luke spun around, but there was no escape. The walls were closing in, their surfaces shifting like liquid, expanding and contracting, as though the very house was breathing. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched the wall. It was cold, colder than it should have been, but it was more than that. It wasn't just the cold of a neglected house. It was the cold of something alive, something that felt aware. He stepped back, his mind screaming for him to get out, to find a way out. But the house had no doors, no windows. The walls had no openings. There was nothing but the dark, suffocating air, the whispers filling the room, the sound of breathing, his breathing, and the thing, the presence, the figure, looming in the corner of his vision. It was there, watching him. "You belong here now," it said, its voice soft and smooth, like a cold wind. "You are mine." Luke tried to scream, but no sound came out. His chest tightened, his throat constricted as though the very air in the room was choking him, suffocating him. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't think. The house had claimed him. It had always claimed him, and as the figure stepped closer, as its fingers stretched toward him, Luke understood. The house wasn't just following him, it had been waiting for him to come home. The Chapter 4, The House Awakens, expands on Luke's experience with the malevolent force in the woods, exploring his growing realization that the house is not merely a haunted structure, but a living, breathing entity. The house has always been a part of him, and its influence extends far beyond physical space, seeping into his mind and soul. The terror becomes more psychological, as the house begins to warp his reality, and Luke faces the crushing weight of his own fears as he succumbs to the house's power. Let me know if you would like any further elaboration or specific changes. Chapter 5, The Mirror's Reflection. Luke's body ached with exhaustion, each step heavy and reluctant, as though the very air around him had grown thicker, suffocating. The house, his house, was closing in on him. The walls that once seemed sturdy and unchanging now pulsated with a slow rhythmic throb, like the heartbeat of something ancient, something alive. Every corner he turned, every room he entered felt different. The house was warping, bending in unnatural ways, stretching and shifting as if it were alive, and it was watching him, waiting. The mirror had been his first mistake. It had caught his attention from the moment he laid eyes on it, standing alone in the attic, surrounded by the dust and decay of forgotten years. Its surface was smooth, reflecting nothing but the dim, flickering light that barely penetrated the attic's gloom. But there had been something about it, something wrong. It had drawn him in, pulling him closer as if it were whispering his name, beckoning him with its silent promise. He had stepped closer, curious, unable to resist its call. The moment his fingers brushed the glass, the world around him had seemed to shift, like a subtle tremor beneath the earth, rattling his sense of reality. The mirror wasn't just a reflection. It was a doorway, a portal to something far darker, far more sinister than he could comprehend. And now, the house was more than just a place. It was a trap. It was consuming him, devouring his thoughts, his memories, his very sense of self. The walls seemed to close in around him as he wandered through the maze of corridors, each hallway more oppressive than the last, each room more suffocating. He couldn't find the way out. The house was no longer just a space. It had become his mind, twisting and distorting his thoughts, his fears, until he no longer knew where the house ended and where he began. Luke reached out and touched the wall beside him, the cold surface sending a shiver down his spine. His fingers brushed against the peeling wallpaper, the rough texture of age and neglect. But as his hand trailed downward, his fingers touched something different. A groove, a crack in the wall, as though something had been hidden here, waiting to be uncovered. His heart thudded painfully in his chest as he pressed his palm against the wall, feeling the strange, sticky sensation beneath his skin. It wasn't just the grime of old decay, it was something alive, pulsing beneath the surface. He drew his hand back, recoiling with a gasp, but as he did, the air grew colder, colder than he had ever felt before. It wasn't just a temperature drop. No, it was as if the very presence of the house was sucking the warmth from his body, pulling the life out of him with every breath. The whispers had returned. They were louder now, filling the air around him, pressing into his mind. They were no longer faint murmurs, distant echoes of forgotten memories. They were real. He could hear them clearly now, speaking his name, urging him forward, pulling him deeper into the house. He stepped backward, his heart racing, but his feet didn't obey him. He couldn't move. He couldn't escape. The whispers were in his head now, filling every corner of his thoughts, sinking into his very soul. He had been running from them, hiding from them, but it was futile. He could no longer deny their presence. They were part of him now, as much as the house itself. "You belong here," they whispered. "You are one of us." The walls around him seemed to shift once more, the patterns of the wallpaper warping and twisting, as if they were alive, as if they were moving, breathing with him. He reached out again, his fingers brushing against the wall, but this time, the surface felt different, smooth, like glass. He pressed harder, and to his horror, the wall gave way, the surface shuddering beneath his touch. With a sickening crack, the wall opened before him. A doorway. Luke stood frozen for a moment, his breath caught in his throat. There was no sound, no movement, just the faint hum of the house surrounding him. He could feel it, the weight of its presence pressing down on him, suffocating him from all sides. He didn't want to go in. He didn't want to see what lay beyond, but something, the house, was pulling him forward. He stepped through the doorway. Beyond the wall, the room was different. The air was thicker, more oppressive, and as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he saw it. The mirror. It was larger now, standing in the center of the room, its surface dark and smooth, reflecting nothing but the emptiness around it. But there was something wrong with it, something he couldn't place, something that felt alive. It pulsed with an eerie glow, the reflections in it twisting, stretching, bending as if they were not quite reflections at all, but something else entirely, something wrong. Luke approached the mirror slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't tear his eyes away from it. He reached out, his fingers trembling as they hovered just above the glass. For a moment there was nothing, and then, with a jolt, his reflection changed. It wasn't him, not entirely. It was him, but twisted, distorted, his features stretched, his eyes hollow and dark, his face a grimace, as though something inside him had broken and was now spilling out. The reflection smiled. No, it grinned, its mouth widening too much, too far, the edges of its lips splitting unnaturally as if it were being torn open from the inside. Luke recoiled, his heart slamming in his chest as he stumbled backward. But the reflection, no, the thing, stayed in the mirror, watching him, its twisted smile never faltering. "You can't escape." The voice was no longer a whisper. It was inside his mind now, a low growl that rumbled deep in his chest, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Luke's hands trembled as they reached for the mirror, his fingers almost touching the glass. But as his hand neared the surface, the reflection in the mirror changed again. This time, it wasn't just his twisted image, it was the room, his room, the one from his house. The bed, the walls, the shelves. It was his own room, but it was different. It was dark, the windows obscured, the air thick with shadows. And there, sitting on the bed, was a figure, a woman. She was shrouded in shadow, her face obscured by her hair. But Luke knew who she was. He had seen her before, in dreams, in flashes of memory. The same woman who had been in his nightmares for as long as he could remember. The one who whispered to him in the dark. The one whose presence hung over him like a suffocating weight. She stood up from the bed, her movements slow and deliberate, and as she took a step toward the mirror, her eyes, locked onto Luke's. "You're mine now," she said, her voice cold, smooth like ice. "You have always been mine." The words seemed to resonate through the very air, vibrating in his skull, sending waves of panic crashing through him. He could feel it now, the coldness, the unnatural cold that seeped into his skin, his bones. The woman's gaze was relentless, her eyes dark and hollow, as though they were staring into the very depths of his soul. Luke reached for the mirror again, desperate, his fingers brushing the cold surface. But the moment he touched it, the reflection in the glass shifted again. This time it wasn't just the woman, it was him, his reflection. But the expression was wrong, twisted, a mockery of his own face. The figure in the mirror smiled, its lips stretched too wide, its teeth sharp and jagged, dripping with something dark and foul. Luke pulled his hand away in horror, stumbling backward, his heart thudding in his chest. But the room, the house, didn't let him go. The walls were closing in again, bending and twisting like they were alive, like they were part of the nightmare that was now his reality. The house wasn't just a house. It was a prison, and there was no way out. Chapter 5. The mirror's reflection delves deeper into the psychological horror Luke faces as he begins to lose touch with reality. The mirror, once an object of curiosity, becomes a portal into something far more sinister. The house warps his perception, and as Luke confronts the reflection of his own twisted fears, he realizes that the house is not just a physical space, it is a living entity, feeding on his terror and pulling him deeper into its grasp. The chapter intensifies the themes of identity, fear, and the blurring of reality and nightmare. Chapter 6. The Roots of the House. Luke had always believed that a house was just a house. It was a structure, a place where people lived, where memories were made. He never thought there could be anything more to it, nothing more than the walls that surrounded him, the rooms where he slept, where he ate, where he felt safe. But now, as he stumbled through the winding corridors of the house, his understanding was shattered. This place, this house, was not just a structure. It was something else entirely. The walls seemed to breathe around him, each shift in the air like the intake of a deep, slow breath. The floors creaked and groaned under his feet, but there was a sound underneath it all. Something deeper, darker, like the thrum of an ancient pulse. It wasn't the house settling. Not this time. No, this was something else. Something that had been waiting for him. Luke could feel it in his bones now. The pull, the gravity of the house. Every step he took, the shadows seemed to lengthen, stretching out toward him like hungry fingers, eager to pull him deeper into the heart of the darkness. The house was no longer a backdrop to his life. It had become the thing controlling everything. The force behind every whisper, every shadow, every flicker of movement out of the corner of his eye. He had tried to resist it. He had tried to escape, but it was inevitable. The house had always known this moment would come. It had always known that he would walk these halls, feel its breath on his neck, and finally understand what it truly was. The air was thick with something old, something rotten, a scent of decay that clung to the walls, seeping through the floorboards, wrapping around him like a blanket. It was the smell of something ancient, something buried deep beneath the surface of the house, its roots sinking into the earth itself, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Luke's mind raced as he stumbled forward, his footsteps unsteady, his body shaking with dread. He had to keep moving, he had to get out, but the house wouldn't let him go. It wouldn't let him leave. The doorways were wrong, the windows too far away, as though the house itself had shifted, rearranged itself, its very structure bending to its will. The walls seemed to pulse, the doors stretching and narrowing, as if the house was alive, feeding off his fear. He turned another corner, his hand shaking as it brushed against the wall. But instead of the cold, solid plaster he expected, his fingers brushed against something slick, like flesh. His heart skipped a beat as he recoiled, pulling his hand back, eyes wide. But when he glanced down, there was nothing there, just the damp, crumbling plaster of the hallway. The whispering began again. It was faint at first, a soft murmur that seemed to come from the walls, from the very foundation of the house. It wasn't a voice. It was a feeling, a sense that something was watching, Something was listening. The deeper Luke went into the house, the stronger the feeling became. It pressed against him, the walls growing tighter, the darkness closing in. The house seemed to know him, to remember him. Suddenly the whispers stopped. A terrible silence settled over the house. The weight of it was suffocating, like the world itself had gone still, holding its breath, waiting. Luke froze in place. The darkness seemed to deepen, folding in on itself, and in the silence, he could hear it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. They were faint at first, a soft padding of feet against the floor, but as Luke's heartbeat thudded in his ears, the sound grew louder, closer. He wanted to run, to turn and escape, but his legs refused to move. He was rooted to the spot, unable to tear his eyes away from the blackness ahead of him. Then, in the darkness, a shape began to take form. A figure, a silhouette. It was tall, impossibly tall. Its body stretched in unnatural ways, its limbs elongating like shadows, stretching and twisting in the darkness. Its face was obscured, but Luke could feel its eyes, its presence, burning into him. He tried to move, tried to scream, but his throat closed, his body paralyzed. The figure stepped closer, gliding silently through the air, its feet not touching the ground. It was like it was floating. No, drifting, gliding toward him, its shadow enveloping him, and then it spoke. The voice was not a whisper. It was a low, deep, guttural sound, like the rumble of thunder, but laced with something ancient, something dead. It reverberated through the very air, rattling Luke's bones. "You can never leave," it said. Its voice wasn't just in his ears, it was in his mind, filling every part of him, drowning out everything else. Luke's breath caught in his throat, his heart racing as the figure loomed closer, its face still hidden in the shadows, its presence suffocating. He wanted to fight. He wanted to scream, but he couldn't. His body was trapped, locked in place, as if the very air around him had turned to quicksand, pulling him deeper into the earth, deeper into the house. The figure extended its hand, fingers twisted and elongated, claws like sharp, jagged bones. It reached for him, its grip closing around his wrist with an icy, suffocating pressure, its touch colder than death itself. He gasped, but no sound came out. The cold burned through his skin, seeping into his very bones, as though the touch of the figure was draining the warmth from him. The air grew thinner, harder to breathe, and the house seemed to close in around him. The walls pressed against his body, the shadows stretching like tendrils to wrap around him. And then, it was gone. The figure, the whispers, the air, the pressure. All of it vanished in an instant, as if it had never been there at all. Luke stood alone in the hallway, the darkness still heavy around him. But there was no figure, no sound. It was as though nothing had happened, but he knew it had. He could feel it. The house was alive. It was changing him, bending him to its will, erasing the boundaries between what was real and what was not. He staggered backward, his mind spinning, his head reeling with confusion. His body was trembling, every inch of him soaked in cold sweat. The house had claimed him. It had always claimed him. It had been watching, waiting for him to realize that it was more than just a house. It was a thing, a force, a living presence that had been feeding on him, feeding on his fear, his confusion, his very soul. Luke turned and ran, his feet pounding against the floor, his breath ragged and panicked. He had to get out. He had to escape. But the house wasn't done with him. The walls closed in as he ran, the doors shifting out of his reach, the windows blocked by thick, impenetrable shadows. The house wasn't just a physical structure. It was a prison, a living, breathing entity that had consumed him. The door he had been running toward, a way out, wasn't there anymore. Instead, the hallway stretched on, farther and farther, until it felt like the house itself was endless. A labyrinth with no way out, no way to escape. The whispers returned, but now they were louder, closer. They were in his mind, in his blood, in his very thoughts. They were not just echoes from the past. They were his thoughts, his fears, feeding into the house's power. The house was alive, and it had him. "You belong to me now," the voice said again, this time closer, clearer. It was not the figure anymore. It was the house itself, speaking to him, calling him to its heart. Luke wanted to scream, to run, but he was trapped. There was no escape from the house. It had always been here, waiting for him. He collapsed to his knees, his mind spinning as the shadows reached out for him, pulling him into the dark. He had been running from it for so long, but now there was no place to run. The house had won. Chapter 6. The roots of the house deepens the psychological horror of the story, revealing that the house is not just a physical structure, but a living entity that feeds on fear, memory, and the soul. Luke's perception of reality crumbles as he faces the terror of being trapped, unable to escape the grasp of the house that has always been with him. The boundaries between fear and reality, between the house and his own mind, continue to blur, and Luke is drawn deeper into the dark heart of the house. Chapter 7. The heart of the house. The house was no longer just a house. It was his prison, his mind, and his soul, all twisted into one. The walls, those cold, crumbling things, had become alive, breathing with every step he took. The floors that once seemed so solid and secure now groaned beneath him, as if they were shifting and bending under the weight of something far heavier than the house itself. And all the while, the whispers, the maddening whispers, continued to echo through the darkness, growing louder, louder, until they were no longer whispers. They were voices, they were commands, they were the house itself speaking to him, filling his mind, consuming his thoughts. Luke couldn't tell how long he had been wandering through the halls. Time had become irrelevant here, twisted by the house into something warped, something that no longer made sense. The passageways stretched impossibly long, twisting back on themselves, like some grotesque maze that was designed to trap him, to ensnare him in its dark heart. Every turn he made led him deeper into the bowels of the house, every step taking him farther away from the world he once knew, farther away from himself. It had all started with the door, the one that had opened before him, beckoning him in, its dark presence a promise, a seduction. It was the house, Luke realized now, that had called him to this place, not just to this room, but to the very core of its existence. The door had been a threshold, a gateway, but now there were no more doors. There was no escape. The house had claimed him, and there was nowhere to run. The walls were alive with sound, with breath. He could hear it now clearer than ever. The house was breathing. He could feel it in the floorboards beneath him, in the walls around him, in the very air that pressed against his skin, as if the house had become an extension of his own body. It was breathing with him, syncing with the rhythm of his heartbeat. And as he stood there, frozen in place, the weight of it pressed down on him like a heavy, suffocating blanket, wrapping him in darkness. He had been running from it, running from the whispers, from the shadowy figure that had been stalking him through every room, every hall. But now there was no more running. The thing in the house was no longer just a presence. It was part of him, and he was part of it. Luke's hand reached out instinctively and placed itself against the wall. The coldness of the surface sent a shiver through him, but as he pressed harder, the wall seemed to respond, shifting beneath his touch like the skin of a living thing. The wood groaned, as if it were alive, as though the house was acknowledging his presence, as though it had been waiting for him to understand, to feel it. The whispers grew louder. "You're almost there," they whispered, their voices becoming more distinct, more urgent. It was no longer just a murmur in the air. It was inside his head now, like a constant hum beneath his thoughts, feeding on his fear, his confusion. "You belong here." The words were like poison, sliding into his mind, taking root, feeding his dread. He wanted to scream, to run, but his legs were heavy, his body rooted to the spot. The darkness around him thickened, pressing in, and the air grew colder still. His breath misted in front of him, a pale cloud that seemed to linger in the frigid air. And then, the floor beneath him trembled. It was a subtle vibration at first, like the shudder of a distant earthquake, but it quickly grew stronger. The house was moving. The walls around him seemed to breathe in time with the tremors, like lungs expanding and contracting, pulling the very air from his chest. Luke staggered back, his heart pounding violently in his chest, but the house didn't let him go. The walls were closing in on him, shifting, bending, trapping him in this claustrophobic nightmare. The house was alive. The house had always been alive. Luke's head spun, his vision blurring at the edges. He felt like he was being pulled into the very foundation of the house itself, as if the house had grown roots deep in the earth and was dragging him down into them. The floor was no longer solid. It felt like soft earth beneath his feet, like he was standing on the edge of a great chasm, a hole that had no bottom, a black pit that stretched into the abyss. The whispering continued, but now, it wasn't just the house, it was him, his own thoughts, distorted and twisted by the house, by the terror that had consumed him. He was no longer sure where his thoughts ended and the house's began. The two had merged, become one. His mind was no longer his own. The house knew him. It knew his fears, his thoughts, his memories. It was inside him, and it was growing stronger. Suddenly, the air shifted. The weight, the suffocating pressure, was gone. For a brief moment, the house let him breathe. The walls stopped shifting, the floor stopped trembling. The oppressive darkness that had gripped him loosened, just enough for him to feel something. It wasn't freedom, not yet, but it was a moment of clarity. Ahead of him, there was a door. A single door, standing at the end of the hallway, its surface dark and sleek, like a mirror. It shimmered in the dim light, reflecting nothing but the blackness around it. But Luke knew. He knew that beyond that door was something more than just another room. It was the heart of the house, the very core of its power, its true form. The whispers told him to go. Step through, they urged. Come home. He had never felt more terrified in his life, yet he couldn't stop himself. His body moved on its own, his legs carrying him toward the door, toward the source of his torment, toward whatever waited on the other side. It was an instinct, a pull he couldn't explain, but it felt like the only way forward. It was the house, pulling him in, feeding on his fear. With a trembling hand, Luke reached for the door handle. The moment his fingers brushed against it, the world around him shuddered. The darkness deepened, thickened, and the cold returned with a vengeance. The walls trembled again, as if the house was coming alive, reacting to his touch, reacting to him. He opened the door. The room beyond was different. It was vast, endless, like a cavern stretching out in all directions. The air was thick with dust, the smell of decay and mildew, but there was something more, something older, deeper, lurking in the corners. It was as if the room had existed long before the house had been built, as if it had always been here, waiting. The walls were covered in strange symbols, carved into the stone, glowing faintly in the dim light. The floor was uneven, cracked in places, and in the center of the room stood an altar. It was made of black stone, jagged and unnatural, like something ripped from the earth itself. On top of the altar was something, or someone, a figure, lying motionless in the center. The air around it was thick with an unnatural energy, a pulse, a heartbeat. The figure on the altar was him. Luke's breath caught in his throat as he took a step forward, his eyes fixed on the figure. It was a perfect reflection of himself, his own body, but pale, twisted, and covered in dark, foul symbols. The skin stretched unnaturally tight over the bones, as though it had been pulled and manipulated by some unseen force. His heart pounded in his chest as he reached out, his fingers trembling, and when his hand hovered over the figure, the house shuddered again. The whispers filled his mind, louder than ever before, a chorus of voices all speaking at once, speaking in unison. You were always meant to be here. Suddenly, the figure on the altar's eyes opened. They were black, hollow pits that seemed to swallow the light. They locked onto Luke's, and in that moment, the world stopped.